Millionaire CEO's life turns upside down after a clumsy intern's coffee mishap. Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. New York, a chaotic Monday morning. The alarm clock blared relentlessly. Sophie Carter jolted awake, her messy curls tumbling over her face. She grabbed her phone in a panic. 8:15 a.m. Damn it, my interview is at 9. Her tiny apartment instantly turned into a war zone. She hopped on one foot while pulling on her stockings, knocked over her mascara into the sink, and struggled to tie her hair up. But a few stubborn curls refused to stay in place. She grabbed her bag, stuffed in a few documents, and dashed out the door. Outside, the Manhattan streets were packed. Sophie frantically waved for a cab, but every single one was occupied. No other option. She sprinted down the sidewalk, the sharp clacking of her high heels echoing off the pavement. The Sinclair Enterprises building loomed ahead, a massive glass tower piercing the clear blue sky. LED billboards flashed, Sinclair Enterprises, home of the brightest minds. Sophie stormed through the grand lobby, her heart pounding. The elevator doors were closing. Without thinking, she picked up speed, her heels slipping slightly on the polished marble floor. A brutal collision. Her steaming hot coffee went flying, landing straight onto someone's pristine white shirt. The world seemed to freeze. The man in front of her stood motionless, his sharp gray eyes darkening. His chiseled jawline tightened, and his perfectly styled black hair barely moved. His tailored black suit, once immaculate, was now ruined, coffee soaking into the expensive fabric. Ethan Sinclair, the CEO of Sinclair Enterprises, the man at the helm of one of the most powerful financial empires in the country. A man everyone in the industry either feared or respected. Sophie's throat went dry. "Oh my God, I am so sorry. I'll clean it up right away." She rummaged through her bag, yanking out some napkins and frantically dabbing at his shirt, only to make it worse by smearing the stain even more. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his voice cold as steel. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" A hushed wave of whispers spread through the lobby. Employees stood frozen in shock, exchanging nervous glances. She just spilled coffee on Ethan Sinclair. Sophie felt her stomach drop. Not only had she just physically crashed into the CEO, but she had also drenched him in coffee, in front of a whole crowd of his employees. Ethan exhaled slowly, adjusting his cufflinks, his gaze as sharp as a blade. His voice was measured, dangerously calm. "Do you have any idea how much this suit costs?" Sophie swallowed hard. This was bad. Really bad. She hadn't even made it to the interview yet. Had she just lost her only chance at the job, or was this just the beginning of a far more complicated fate? Morning sunlight filtered through the towering glass windows of Sinclair Enterprises, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. But inside the high-rise executive conference room on the 50th floor, the air was thick with tension. Sophie Carter sat on the plush leather chair, trying not to fidget under the intense scrutiny of Ethan Sinclair, the man she had unknowingly baptized with coffee just minutes ago. The air felt heavier than it should. The silence stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Across the sleek glass table, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his piercing gray eyes scanning her resume with deliberate slowness. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier to handle. Instead, he looked calculating, like he was deciding whether she was worth his time at all. Finally, he set the folder down with an almost lazy movement and folded his arms across his chest. His voice, when it came, was smooth, controlled. Too controlled. "Give me one good reason why I should hire you after that disaster of a first impression." Each word was measured, like he was sizing her up, deciding how much of a challenge she would be. Sophie felt a flicker of panic, but she swallowed it down. She had prepared answers for this interview. She had researched every detail about this company. But all of that knowledge was useless now, because the only thing that mattered in this moment was him. The man across from her, who could end this interview with a single word. She took a steady breath, forcing herself not to break eye contact. "Because I don't quit," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "I may be clumsy, but I work with my whole heart." A beat of silence. Ethan's brow arched ever so slightly, as if he had just heard something mildly amusing. The air between them crackled, an unspoken challenge settling in the space between his icy indifference and her quiet determination. Then, the door swung open. A man in his late 50s, dressed in a precisely tailored gray suit, strode in. The click of his polished shoes echoed in the tension-filled room. His silver-rimmed glasses reflected the sharp office lights as he placed a stack of thick files on the table. This was Richard Carter, Ethan's personal assistant. A man renowned for his efficiency, for keeping Sinclair Enterprises running like a well-oiled machine. Without looking at Sophie, Richard adjusted his glasses and spoke calmly, but with the urgency of someone who knew time was a commodity Ethan despised wasting. "Mr. Sinclair, your schedule this week is packed. 3 major investor meetings, 2 international business trips that need finalization, and human resources just confirmed. There is still no suitable candidate for your personal secretary." Sophie felt something shift in the air. Ethan didn't move, but she saw the faintest twitch in his jaw, the slightest tightening of his fingers where they rested on the table. He was calculating. She didn't need to know him to see the decision taking form behind those unreadable gray eyes. No secretary meant his schedule would descend into chaos. And if there was one thing Ethan Sinclair hated, it was chaos. But hiring her? Sophie wasn't an idiot. She knew she wasn't exactly the ideal choice. She couldn't balance a coffee cup, let alone handle the logistics of a corporate empire. And yet, Ethan exhaled slowly, then tilted his head, his voice cool and clipped. 1-month trial period. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Wait. What? Richard visibly stiffened. His gaze flicked to Ethan in quiet disbelief. "Sir, are you sure?" Ethan barely spared him a glance. Instead, his focus remained locked on Sophie, his tone dropping to something almost amused. "She won't last a week." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Not a compliment. A challenge. Something inside Sophie tightened. She could feel it, the unspoken dare in his words. He expected her to fail. She could walk away now, save herself from the inevitable embarrassment, the crushing weight of working under a man who clearly thought she was nothing but an inconvenience. Or she could stay and prove him wrong. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head on. We'll see about that. What neither of them knew was that this decision would change both their lives forever. The first day, a storm brewing. The sun had barely risen over Sinclair Enterprises, yet inside the ultra-modern glass skyscraper, the day was already in full motion. Employees moved like clockwork, crisp suits, quick steps, quiet conversations buzzing in the background. At exactly 7:59 a.m., Ethan Sinclair, the ruthlessly efficient, impeccably dressed CEO, stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor. His expression was unreadable, his pace deliberate, every move calculated. He expected one thing and one thing only: perfection. And then there was Sophie Carter. Standing in the hallway, frantically flipping through a notepad, her hair slightly disheveled from the wind outside, a coffee stain on her blouse that she hadn't even noticed yet. A disaster waiting to happen. She had exactly one job today. Do not mess up. Except she already had. Ethan's gaze locked onto her. Sophie, his voice was clipped, businesslike. Where's the boardroom? Sophie blinked. The boardroom. The one she had been supposed to reserve for his morning meeting. The meeting with 5 of the top investors in the country. The blood drained from her face. Oh. The boardroom. Sophie's voice trailed off as she frantically flipped through her notes, looking for the confirmation. It wasn't there, because she had forgotten to book it. Ethan's jaw tightened. His fingers tapped once against his watch, a silent reminder that he did not waste time. Sophie panicked. She scanned the office floor like a drowning swimmer searching for a life raft. And then, in a stroke of sheer desperation, she blurted out, "There's a great coffee shop downstairs." A silence so heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Ethan's gray eyes darkened. "You want me to hold an executive meeting?" He enunciated each word slowly, deliberately. "In a coffee shop?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, as if saying it with more confidence would make it sound less ridiculous. Another silence. Then, "Fine," Ethan said flatly. "You're coming with me." Sophie's stomach dropped. This was going to be a disaster. And it was. The meeting from hell. 20 minutes later, 5 of the wealthiest men in the country sat shoulder to shoulder in a crowded cafe, squinting at Ethan's presentation on a laptop screen, while a barista blended a smoothie at full volume just 3 feet away. Ethan sat at the head of the small table, unflinching, while Sophie wanted to disappear into the floor. At one point, the elderly investor on the left leaned over and said, "Son, you do know you own a billion-dollar empire, right?" Ethan's expression did not change, but Sophie could feel the murderous energy radiating from him. She was so fired. The second disaster. The lost email. Back at the office, Sophie knew she had to redeem herself. So when she saw hundreds of unread emails in Ethan's inbox, she took matters into her own hands. She would organize them. She clicked. She deleted. She categorized. And then, with one slip of her finger, she accidentally permanently erased an email labeled "Confidential Contract Approval Carter Holdings." Sophie stared at the screen. "No, no, no, no," she whispered, her hands flying to the keyboard, clicking frantically. She checked the trash. Empty. Her entire body turned cold. Then, a voice, right behind her. "Sophie. Ethan." She turned slowly, her face frozen in terror. "I need the Carter Holdings email," he said, his tone completely calm, completely unreadable. Sophie swallowed. Ethan's brows lifted one fraction of an inch. The longer she stayed silent, the more his patience thinned. "Sophie." She forced a painful smile. "What if I told you there was a slight, hiccup?" Ethan stared at her. "Hiccup? I may have, slightly, lost it?" The room went dead silent. Ethan's jaw ticked. "You lost it." Sophie nodded weakly. "You lost a multi-million-dollar contract approval email." Sophie nodded again, smaller this time. Ethan exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for exactly 3 seconds before pulling out his phone. And for the next 30 minutes, Sophie sat there, watching in horror as Ethan personally called every single investor, trying to recover the contract that she had just deleted from existence. When he finally hung up, he set his phone down with excruciating slowness. Then, without looking up, he said, "Remind me why I hired you again?" Sophie winced. "Because no one else was available?" The final straw. The tea incident. Desperate to fix her mistakes, Sophie remembered that every assistant before her had always brought Ethan his evening tea. A simple, safe task. She carefully prepared it, Hot water, fresh tea leaves, a delicate balance of sugar. Wait. Was that sugar? Sophie squinted at the tiny white granules in the glass container. Sugar and salt looked awfully similar, didn't they? Oh well. She stirred in a generous amount and carried the cup into Ethan's office. Ethan, still clearly recovering from the disaster of the day, took the first sip and immediately froze. Sophie held her breath. He slowly set the cup down and looked at her. Dead. In. The eye. Sophie. Yes? Did you just put salt in my tea? Sophie's eyes widened. Oh, that wasn't sugar? Ethan's expression remained blank, but his fingers tightened subtly around the edge of his desk. A beat of silence, then, I have had terrible assistants before, Ethan said evenly, dangerously, but you have officially surpassed every record in history. Sophie crossed her arms. Well, she shot back, at least I haven't burned the office down yet. Ethan stared at her. His jaw tensed, his shoulders squared, his entire presence radiated barely contained frustration. And then, the corner of his mouth twitched. For half a second, Sophie thought, was that a smile? No. Impossible. But before she could say anything, Ethan cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and muttered, Get out of my office. And for the first time all day, Sophie walked away smiling, because something told her. This war was just beginning. The office was nearly silent. Outside, the city pulsed with the soft hum of traffic, neon lights flickering against the towering glass windows of Sinclair Enterprises. Inside, however, the world felt still, untouched by the chaos beyond. Everyone had gone home, except for Sophie Carter. She sat on the cold floor of the company's record storage room, her legs folded beneath her, surrounded by mountains of old files that stretched toward the dim overhead lights. She was exhausted. But she had no choice. Earlier that day, Sophie had mishandled an invoice, a critical one. A deal worth millions of dollars was now at risk because of her mistake. She had barely survived Ethan Sinclair's wrath. Now she was determined to fix it before he found out. Her fingers flipped through the files, her brows furrowed in frustration. It had to be here somewhere. And then, the sound. A sharp, metallic click. Sophie froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Slowly, she turned her head toward the door. It was closed. She got up instantly, reaching for the handle, twisting it frantically. Nothing. A cold wave of panic washed over her. No, 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 no! She pulled harder, jiggled it, shook it. Still nothing. Sophie took a slow, deep breath, pressing her forehead against the door. She was locked in. Meanwhile, Ethan Sinclair had never been a man to stay late at the office. His world functioned on precision, scheduled meetings, calculated risks, and an unshakable routine. Yet tonight, something felt off. As he made his way toward the elevator, his eyes narrowed at the sight of a single light still on in the archive section. No one should be here. A slight crease formed between his brows. With his usual unhurried steps, he walked toward the storage room. A muffled voice reached his ears. Hello? Is anyone out there? A beat, then a loud bang. Ethan's jaw tensed. Sophie. He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling slowly. This woman was a walking disaster. He reached for the door handle and turned it. Locked. He knocked once. No response. Then, a second, louder thud. What the hell are you doing in there? Ethan's voice was calm, yet undeniably laced with annoyance. Inside, Sophie froze. Oh, no, not him. Anyone but him. Hi, she called through the door, her voice too cheerful for someone trapped inside a supply closet. Ethan closed his eyes, silently counting to 3. Sophie, he said, his patience wearing thin. Explain. A pause. I was looking for a file, and, well, I might have gotten locked in. Silence. Then, Ethan sighed. Of course. He pulled out his master keycard, swiped it against the lock, and with a soft beep, the door swung open. The sight that greeted him? Sophie, half buried in a pile of documents, her hair in wild disarray, dark circles forming beneath her eyes, her expression a mix of relief and complete humiliation. For a moment, Ethan just stared at her. The mess. The chaos. And then, for reasons even he didn't understand, his eyes trailed to the small, exhausted slump of her shoulders, and something shifted. He had assumed she was careless, that she didn't take this job seriously. But now? Now he saw it, the determination, the genuine effort. The way she had stayed hours past work, drowning in files, really trying to fix her mistake. Without a word, Ethan extended his hand toward her. Sophie stared at it. Was this a trap? Ethan Sinclair? Helping her? Still, hesitantly, she placed her hand in his. The moment his fingers curled around hers, he pulled her up with zero effort, the sudden motion making her stumble slightly forward. For the briefest second, their bodies were too close. Sophie felt the heat of his presence, his steady breath, the sharp scent of expensive cologne. She took a step back. So did he. The moment passed too quickly, like it had never happened at all. You need to go home, Ethan said, his voice back to its usual business-like tone. Sophie hesitated. I still need to find the... Ethan cut her off with a look, a warning. A second passed. Then, reluctantly, Sophie nodded. She turned toward the doorway, stepping past him. But for some reason she paused. She looked back. And for the first time, Ethan wasn't looking at her like a walking disaster. He was just looking at her. Something unfamiliar flashed in his gaze, and Sophie felt something stir deep inside her chest. She quickly looked away. Then, without another word, she disappeared down the hall. Ethan remained in the storage room for a moment longer, staring at the empty space where she had just stood. Something about tonight felt different. Something about Sophie Carter was different. And for the first time since she had walked into his life, Ethan wasn't entirely sure he wanted her to leave. The Sinclair Enterprises annual gala was a spectacle of wealth and power, an event where champagne flowed like water, and every guest in the room had more money in their bank account than Sophie Carter could ever dream of. The ballroom was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooked the city skyline. Golden chandeliers cast a soft, shimmering glow over the perfectly polished marble floors. Soft orchestral music played in the background, adding an air of refinement to the night. Sophie Carter felt completely out of place. Standing in the middle of it all, dressed in a gown that Ethan's personal stylist had picked out for her, she still felt like an imposter. Because she did not belong here. She clutched her champagne flute a little tighter, her fingers wrapped around the delicate crystal. And next to her, Ethan Sinclair, poised, powerful, untouchable. He wore confidence like a second skin, the black tuxedo perfectly tailored to his broad shoulders. His presence commanded the room. Even without speaking, people stole glances in his direction, eager for a moment of his time. And Sophie? She was just his assistant. She wasn't meant to stand beside him like this. She was only here because Ethan had insisted. Because as much as she had tried to get out of it, he had simply looked at her, his sharp, unreadable gaze locking onto hers, and said, "You work for me, Carter. That means you're coming. End of discussion." So here she was, trying not to drown in a sea of people who all seemed to belong to another world. Sophie, isn't it? The voice was smooth, polished, the kind that belonged to a woman who had never been told no. Sophie turned. Victoria Laurent. Tall, elegant, impossibly beautiful. One of Sinclair Enterprises' most influential business partners, and, if rumors were to be believed, a woman who had her eyes set on Ethan Sinclair for years. The second their gazes met, Sophie felt it. That sharp, assessing look. Victoria wasn't just looking at her, she was sizing her up. And Sophie? She already knew she wasn't going to measure up. Victoria took a slow sip of her wine before offering Sophie a small, almost sympathetic smile. "I must say," she mused, "it's quite unexpected to see you here tonight." Sophie stiffened, but forced a polite smile. "I work for Mr. Sinclair," she replied simply. Victoria let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Of course." There was something in the way she said it, like the words themselves didn't matter, but the meaning behind them was razor sharp. Then, as if Sophie wasn't even there, Victoria turned to another guest. Lifting her glass, she sighed dramatically and said, just loud enough for Sophie to hear, "Honestly, it's quite a shame. A man like Ethan Sinclair, burdened with such a mediocre assistant." The words hit like a slap, a sharp, cruel cut designed to humiliate. Sophie's grip tightened on her champagne flute, heat crawling up her neck. She was about to walk away when a hand closed around her wrist, strong, firm. And then, before she could react, Ethan Sinclair pulled her forward and kissed her. The room stilled. For a moment, the music, the murmurs, the sound of clinking glasses, everything disappeared. All that existed was the warmth of Ethan's lips against hers. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't unsure. It was deliberate, a statement, a claim, a warning. Gasps filled the room. Sophie's mind went blank, her body frozen in complete shock. Ethan Sinclair, her boss, the man who barely tolerated her existence, was kissing her. And then, for one single second, she kissed him back. It was instinctive. A brief, uncontrollable moment where her body reacted before her mind caught up. But that second, it was enough. Enough to set her entire world on fire. When Ethan finally pulled away, Sophie was breathless. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her vision slightly blurred from the sheer shock of what had just happened. The room was deathly silent. Dozens of eyes locked onto them, watching, waiting, Victoria included. Ethan turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable, his voice smooth but unmistakably sharp when he finally spoke. "Sophie is not mediocre." A slow, deliberate pause. Then, his gaze flickered to Victoria, his lips curling ever so slightly. "She's mine." The weight of those two words rippled through the room. It was a declaration, not just a response to Victoria's insult, but a challenge. The tension was thick, suffocating. Victoria's face remained poised, but Sophie caught it. The slight tightening of her jaw, the flicker of irritation beneath her carefully controlled mask. She had lost. And Ethan? He had just set the world on fire. Sophie couldn't breathe. She couldn't think, because nothing about this made sense. Ethan had just kissed her, in front of everyone. And now? She had no idea what was real anymore. Was it just to prove a point? To shut Victoria up? Or was there something more? Ethan turned his gaze toward Sophie, his blue eyes dark, intense, searching hers for something she didn't understand. She needed to say something, to demand answers. But all she could do was stare at him, because deep down, in the part of her heart she didn't want to acknowledge, she knew one terrifying truth. That kiss had changed everything. Sophie had spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the gala in her mind. The music, the laughter, the way the champagne fizzed in her glass. And then, That kiss. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a declaration, a statement, a claim. But was it real? Or was it just Ethan Sinclair's way of handling the situation, controlling the narrative the way he always did? The moment it happened, her entire body had locked up in shock. Her heart had betrayed her, pounding against her ribcage as if begging her to believe it meant something. But deep down, a voice whispered, "Don't be a fool. Ethan Sinclair was a master at manipulation, and she was just his assistant. That was all." So the next morning she made a decision. She had to pull away before she lost herself in something that wasn't real. It started small. She came in earlier than usual, long before Ethan arrived. That way she could get everything in order without having to be near him. During meetings, she sat farther away, avoided eye contact. She kept conversations brief, professional, distant. When he called for her, she sent messages instead of walking into his office. And when she saw him passing in the hallways, she found excuses to be elsewhere. But what she hadn't expected was that he would notice, and that he wouldn't let it go. At first, he told himself he didn't care. Why would he? Sophie was just his assistant. Nothing more. But then, little things started to bother him. The way the office felt emptier without her usual clumsy presence. The fact that she no longer argued with him. No more sarcastic remarks, no more stubborn persistence, and worst of all, she had stopped looking at him. It was ridiculous. He had spent weeks annoyed by her chaos, her mistakes, her ability to make even the simplest task a disaster. But now that she was pulling away, now that she was treating him like any other executive in this building, he hated it. It was the third day when Ethan decided he had had enough. That morning, as Sophie was slipping past his office, head down, trying to avoid his gaze, he spoke, low, sharp, and absolute. "Sophie." She froze. For a brief second, he saw her fingers tighten around the folder she was holding. But then her voice came, calm, composed, and painfully professional. "Yes, Mr. Sinclair?" Mr. Sinclair. Not Ethan, not even her usual irritated boss when she was annoyed at him, Mr. Sinclair. And for some reason, that infuriated him. "Stay," he ordered. A pause. She turned, but her expression was unreadable. "There's a lot of work to be done. I said, stay." And this time, there was no room for argument. He walked toward her, closing the distance, just enough to see the way her breathing shifted, how her lips pressed together in frustration. She was fighting something, and Ethan was going to find out what. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air crackled between them, heavy, charged, filled with 1,000 unspoken words. And then, she took a slow, deliberate breath. "I don't understand what you want from me." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Why are you avoiding me?" Sophie let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I work for you. I don't see how that's relevant." "You know exactly how it's relevant," he countered. Silence. Her eyes flickered away for a second, just long enough for him to see the hesitation. Then, when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "That kiss. It didn't mean anything." Something inside him stilled. The words were simple, direct. But the way she said them, like she was trying to convince herself more than him, that was what made him snap. His fingers tightened around the edge of his desk, his patience fraying. "Really?" His voice was dangerously low. "Is that what you think?" She lifted her chin, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's what I know." Ethan took a step forward, and then another, until he was too close. Close enough to see the way her pulse jumped at the base of her throat. Close enough that if he reached out, he could trace his fingers over the soft skin of her wrist, feel the rapid thrum of her heartbeat. But he didn't, because this wasn't about touching her. It was about breaking through whatever wall she was trying to build. "You're lying." Her breath hitched, but she didn't move, didn't step away, and that told him everything. For a long, excruciating second, neither of them spoke. Then, softly, deliberately, he whispered, "Tell me, Sophie, if I kissed you right now, would you still say it meant nothing?" Her lips parted slightly. A flicker of panic, of something deeper, flashed through her eyes. But she was stubborn. She always was. So instead of answering, she took a step back. Not much. Just enough to put a breath of space between them. And then, with a voice that barely held steady, she said, "This isn't real, Ethan." And with that, she turned, walked out of his office, leaving him standing there, fists clenched, as the realization finally hit him that for the first time in his life, he had something to lose, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The city was alive with the sound of honking cars and hurried footsteps. The afternoon rush had begun, and Sophie, as usual, was rushing right along with it. Her arms were full, 2 hot coffees in one hand, a folder of important documents in the other. She was balancing it all while speed-walking back to the office, weaving between pedestrians on the crowded sidewalk. She was late. Ethan had specifically told her, "No mistakes today, Sophie." And yet, here she was, juggling coffee cups like a circus act, trying not to drop the papers that she absolutely could not lose. Then, a cab swerved too close. Someone gasped, a horn blared, and in an instant, the world tilted. The last thing Sophie felt was her foot catching the curb. The sensation of falling. The flash of headlights. And then, darkness. Inside a glass-walled boardroom on the top floor of Sinclair Enterprises, Ethan Sinclair sat at the head of the table, delivering one of the most critical presentations of the year. His voice was sharp. His posture was controlled. The executives hung on his every word as he laid out the company's next major investment strategy. Everything was calculated. Precise. Until his phone buzzed. Once, twice, a third time. He ignored it, at first. Then his assistant, looking hesitant, stepped into the room and placed a note in front of him. "Urgent. Sophie. Accident. Hospital." The words blurred in front of him. Something tightened in his chest. Ethan never left meetings. Never. Yet before anyone could react, he stood, closed his laptop, and without a word, walked out. The hospital hallway. Ethan had been in high-pressure situations before. Multi-million-dollar negotiations, legal battles, market crashes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever felt like this. His steps were brisk, controlled, but his hands, they were clenched into fists. He wasn't even sure he was breathing properly as he pushed through the hospital doors. "Sophie Carter, where is she?" The nurse at the front desk looked up. "Room 217, she..." Ethan was already moving. When he reached the doorway, he stopped, took a breath, then stepped inside. Sophie lay on the hospital bed, her skin too pale against the white sheets. A bandage wrapped around her forehead, her wrist bruised. She looked small. Still, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt helpless. Sophie's eyelids fluttered open to the rhythmic tap, tap, tap of footsteps. The scent of antiseptic filled the air. A heart monitor beeped softly beside her. Then, she saw him. Ethan, standing by the window, his hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. His tie was loosened, his suit jacket discarded. He looked tired. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Why, are you here?" At the sound of her voice, Ethan turned instantly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Relief, frustration, something deeper, something neither of them had words for. "You were in an accident." His voice was rough, controlled, but there was something else beneath it, something raw. Sophie managed a weak smile. "You're stating the obvious, Mr. Sinclair." His jaw tightened. "You could have been seriously hurt." Her smile faded. There was something different in the way he was looking at her. Almost like, "Why are you really here?" she whispered. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I was in a meeting," he admitted. "A major one." Sophie's heart clenched. He had left work for her? "You don't leave meetings," she murmured. He nodded, his gaze intense. "No, I don't." Silence stretched between them. Thick. Heavy. Sophie looked away. "I didn't know I was that important," she said, attempting lightness. Ethan didn't look away. He didn't blink. "You are." Her breath hitched, her fingers curled against the sheets. And just like that, everything changed. The day started like any other. The office buzzed with the usual hum of clicking keyboards, murmured conversations, and the occasional sound of a ringing phone. But Sophie felt different. Ever since that night at the hospital, ever since she woke up to find Ethan sitting by her bed, his face tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name, something had changed. He had been softer, more present, more aware of her. But Sophie? She had been running. She convinced herself it didn't mean anything, that a billionaire CEO like Ethan Sinclair could never see her as anything more than an inconvenience he had grown used to. So she avoided him. She dodged his glances in meetings, pretended not to hear when his voice softened around her, and ignored the way her own heart betrayed her every time he walked into the room. But today, he wasn't going to let her run anymore. Sophie sat at her desk, forcing herself to focus on the screen in front of her. She had work to do. She had things to finish. She just needed to... Bang! The heavy glass doors of the executive suite swung open with force, crashing against the walls. The room fell silent. Conversations halted. Even the air itself seemed to still. And there, in the center of it all, stood Ethan Sinclair. He wasn't in a crisp, controlled stance like usual. His tie was loosened. His sleeves were rolled up. And his blue eyes? They were locked on her. Sophie's pulse jumped. He took a step forward, then another. And before she could process what was happening, he was standing right in front of her desk. She swallowed. "Ethan, what? I need to talk to you." His voice was low, rough, unyielding. She glanced around. Every single person on the floor was staring. "Now?" she whispered. "Now." Sophie hesitated. She could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on them. Then, without waiting for permission, he grabbed her hand. Gasps filled the office as he pulled her up, past stunned assistants and executives, past wide-eyed employees, straight into his office. The door slammed shut behind them. Sophie wrenched her wrist free. "What the hell was that? You can't just—" "I don't care," Ethan said. His voice, low, sharp, filled with something raw, made her freeze. "I don't care what they think," he said. "I don't care what anyone thinks." Sophie's breath caught. She had never seen him like this. "I don't care how many times you spill coffee on me," he continued, his jaw tight. "I don't care how many times you mess up emails or forget my schedule." Sophie's stomach twisted. "I don't care how impossible you are." He took another step closer. All she could see was him, and all she could hear was her own heartbeat. "You think I hired you out of pity?" His voice softened, but the intensity never faded. "You think I kept you around because I had no other choice?" Sophie opened her mouth, but no words came out. Ethan exhaled sharply, his hands flexing at his sides. "You're wrong." Silence. Heavy. Thick. Then, softly, almost like an admission, he said, "I just know I can't lose you." Sophie's chest tightened. For a moment the world stopped. The air between them was electric. Unspoken words, unanswered questions, the weight of something that had been building for months. She needed to say something. She had to, but all she could do was whisper. "Ethan." His gaze dropped to her lips, and that was it. That was all it took. Sophie barely had time to react before his hands were on her face, his lips crushing against hers. And this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a slip or a moment of weakness. It was Ethan Sinclair breaking every rule he had ever lived by. And Sophie? She was too far gone to stop him. The sun had barely begun to set over the city skyline when Sophie's day took an unexpected turn. It started like any other. Emails, calls, the usual chaos of Sinclair Enterprises. And then, her computer screen blinked black. One by one, every monitor in the office followed suit. Murmurs rippled through the room as employees exchanged confused glances. Then, across the darkened screens, a single line of text appeared. "Sophie Harper, report to the executive conference room immediately." She frowned, a strange knot forming in her stomach. What was going on? Whispers spread around her as she slowly rose to her feet. And as she walked toward the glass-walled conference room, she felt every pair of eyes following her. She stepped inside and froze. The long, sleek conference table was completely cleared. Instead, at the center, there was only one thing: a blue velvet box. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. Slowly she turned, and there he was, Ethan Sinclair, standing at the far end of the room, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. But his eyes, they were different. She barely noticed when the glass walls behind her frosted over, sealing them away from the office beyond. Now, it was just the two of them, and the tension in the room was palpable. "Ethan," she whispered, "what is this?" He took a step closer, then another, until he was so close she could barely breathe. And then, he slowly knelt down on one knee, her entire world blurred. "I built this company with my own hands," Ethan said, voice steady yet quiet. "I built my life around control, discipline, perfection." A beat of silence. Then a slow, unsteady breath. "And then you walked in, with your impossible optimism, your relentless spirit, your absolute inability to make a decent cup of coffee." Sophie let out a breathless, nervous laugh. His lips twitched, just slightly. "But Sophie," he continued, his voice softer now, raw with something unfamiliar. "Somewhere between the chaos, the late nights, the arguments, the ridiculous disasters, I fell in love with you." Sophie stilled. Everything in her body screamed move, say something, do something, but she could only stare. "I don't care how many reports you mess up. I don't care how many disasters you cause. I don't even care that you still can't send an email without double-checking with someone." A small, shaky breath. "I just know that without you, this office, this life, feels empty." Her vision blurred. And then, he reached for the small velvet box, flipping it open. A ring. Simple, elegant, unmistakably perfect. "Sophie Harper." His voice was barely above a whisper now. "Marry me." Sophie felt the air rush out of her lungs. This man, this impossible, frustrating, incredible man, was staring at her like she was the only thing that had ever mattered. And suddenly, everything made sense. Every argument, every near disaster, every moment of laughter hidden between the chaos. It had always led to this, to him. A slow, disbelieving smile spread across her face. Then she laughed, a full, delighted, utterly incredulous laugh. "Of course, you idiot." And then, before she could overthink it, before she could let herself hesitate, she dropped to her knees and kissed him. Outside, the entire office was waiting. And when the glass walls finally cleared, revealing Ethan Sinclair kissing the world's most disastrous secretary. The building erupted in cheers. The wedding was nothing like a typical Sinclair event. No black tie formality, no intimidating guest list. Instead, it was warm, lively. It was them. The garden was bathed in golden sunlight as Sophie stood at the altar, her dress slightly crooked, a small ink stain on her sleeve from signing last-minute paperwork that morning. And there, waiting for her, was Ethan. Calm, steady, watching her like she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. When the officiant spoke, asking, "Do you, Ethan Sinclair, take Sophie Harper to be your wife?" He didn't hesitate, not even for a second. "With all my heart." His voice was steady, certain. And when Sophie was asked the same, she grinned, because there was only ever one answer. Forever. And as they kissed, as laughter and applause filled the air, Sophie knew one thing. She may never have been meant for the corporate world, but she was always meant for him. As the night settled and the last of the guests trickled out, Ethan pulled Sophie into a quiet corner of the garden. She arched a brow. "What now?" He smirked, leaning in, and in a low whisper he murmured, "You still owe me a coffee." Sophie burst out laughing, and then she kissed him. Because some love stories, they don't end, they just begin. If you watched until now, comment forever below. What was your favorite moment? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories.